Joystick junkies. Playing too many video games is an illness. It's what parents of Fortnite fanatics have been saying all along. These are just a handful of the headlines from 2018 that followed the news that the World Health Organization had defined gaming disorder in its international classification of diseases. From Fortnite to Candy Crush, concerns have long been raised about games' addictive potential, but for it to be classified as a distinct disorder was a big step. However, the psychology community found itself divided. Some psychologists believe the WHO's decision was based on poorly constructed research and could even spark a moral panic.
We're not that far advanced in our understanding of something that you might want to call video game addiction now compared to 20 years ago, really.
Meanwhile, here in the UK, psychologists at a specialist-run clinic have reported success at treating the condition.
We've been quite surprised how severe it can be for those that are actually affected.
So was the WHO right to make this decision, and does gaming addiction really exist? In 2018, gaming disorder was outlined in the ICD-11, the latest version of a manual which outlines health conditions around the world. The diagnostic criteria for gaming disorder essentially boils down to these factors persisting over a period of at least 12 months. Also included are boundaries of normality. These ensure that normal behaviours, like using games to alleviate boredom or playing games to socialise with friends, are no indication anything is wrong. Those boundaries of normality are important because they outline the difference between a normal, healthy relationship to gaming and an unhealthy, harmful one, which helps limit the potential for misdiagnosis by worried parents who might not know all that much about gaming. It's also useful for the mainstream press as it helps ensure the condition is reported with the level of nuance and detail that such a serious subject matter calls for. Yeah, about that. The WHO's announcement led to a predictable response with the sort of panic-inducing headlines we saw earlier. Phrases like "kids addicted to video games like Fortnite will now have the condition recognised as an official mental disorder" seem tailor-made to make parents rip the controllers from their kids' hands and throw their PlayStations out the window. By the way, it's interesting that they keep mentioning Fortnite, but we'll come back to that. This is Pete Etchells. He's a professor of psychology and science communication at Bath Spa University and the author of Lost in a Good Game, a book about the psychological effects, good and bad, of video games.
If you look at worries about obsessive play with video games, they've been around since the early 1980s. A bunch of doctors who had these three guys that came into their clinic that all presented with very similar symptoms. All three of them were on the verge of getting married. All three of them developed quite strong obsessions with playing Space Invaders. So they take this sort of weird psychoanalytic Freudian approach to it and say, well, the reason that they became obsessed with Space Invaders is because they saw themselves as the tank and their prospective brides-to-be were the invading alien force coming into their homes, which is a really depressing way of thinking about marriage. It was the start, in a way, of this worry around, you look at somebody playing a video game and they're really engrossed in it, they play it for a long time, this maybe doesn't seem right. We're not that far advanced in our understanding of something that you might want to call video game addiction now compared to 20 years ago, really.
In the wake of the WHO's decision, Pete was one of a number of psychologists around the world who voiced his concerns, co-authoring a comment paper that called for the WHO to err on the side of caution. This paper was one of dozens published by psychologists, many of whom took issue with the ways much of the research into gaming disorder had been conducted, by adapting questionnaires designed to measure other addictions.
We know that there are other things that are addictive, so let's take established scales and questionnaires and measures for those things. Take that questionnaire that's got, say, 10, 15, 20 statements that you say are very untrue or very true of you about gambling, and you just replace the word gambling with gaming. So you've got this new gaming addiction questionnaire now, and you give that to 1,000 people, and you will get a spread of scores, right? Some people score 0, some people score 100, and you decide if you score 60 or more, you're considered addicted to games. Are you measuring gaming addiction, though? Because the way that those statements were originally constructed makes sense for gambling, maybe doesn't make so much sense for gaming. And we've never really got past that problem.
One major issue with all of this is that there's very little concrete evidence showing how much of the population might be affected. In its reasoning, the WHO points to a number of reviews it commissioned studying the prevalence of gaming disorder across the world, but the results across these studies suggest the condition might affect anywhere from 0.21% to 57.5% of the gaming population. The results are so varied that even the authors of the WHO commissioned report urged a cautious approach. But this is a really important thing to get right. In 2019, a survey of over 2,000 parents found that half of them feared their children were becoming addicted to playing games. But with no concrete evidence to show exactly how many gamers are affected, it's hard to know how well-founded those fears might be.
The range of 0.1%, 0.2% up to more than 50% is a huge range, right? So something's wrong there, and we're kind of rushing to do research in this area because everybody's worried about Fortnite being addictive or whatever, because that's what we see in the news. And parents care about this sort of stuff, and it's understandable why. But we're not taking the time to just slow down and think about how we study this objectively and properly.
However, outside of research psychology, the WHO's decision had another potentially more significant impact on those people who have actually been diagnosed with the condition. As a direct result of the addition of gaming disorder to the ICD-11, specialist centres began to open, offering treatment for the condition. In London, we visited the National Centre for Gaming Disorders, the only state-funded UK clinic dedicated to treating the condition, and spoke to Rebecca Lockwood, a consultant clinical psychologist, about the impact of the condition on those who suffer from it.
For the people that we see in the clinic, we've been struck by actually quite how much of an impact this has on the gamer themselves and the families. Often there's kind of violence and aggression. Often they are involved in other services, mental health services, social services are involved. We've been kind of struck by the amount of kind of risk for those that struggle with this addiction. Also the impact on physical health, malnourishment. Often people are quite underweight because they're not feeding themselves. On average, we would see people gaming maybe 10, 12 hours a day, and that would be often during night. That will lead to difficulties with attending school and work. So we're not talking about a few hours, we're talking about a considerable period of that person's life that is spent gaming.
Since opening in 2019, a year after the WHO's decision, the clinic reports it has been overwhelmed with referrals for treatment, 70% of which are for people aged 18 or under. In many cases, gaming begins as an immersive and rewarding way to escape from reality, something that I'd imagine resonates with many of us who play games, but that escape becomes an unhealthy compulsion.
We have seen within those that have self-selected to come to the clinic quite high levels of autistic spectrum disorder and ADHD, and also high levels of social anxiety. We've seen people that have come to the clinic because there's been an event in their life, such as bullying or parents' divorce or kind of transition from junior to senior school, and often that's been the kind of trigger for them to start to use gaming as an escape. And then the gaming in itself has become kind of a secondary problem. There's some kind of patterns, even though we can't kind of quantify them at the moment, but we have seen some patterns of people that typically refer to the clinic.
Many of the arguments against including gaming disorder in the ICD-11 centre around the lack of evidence that gaming itself is causing harm. But does that actually matter if the result is a clinic that helps people deal with both the symptom and the underlying cause? Following treatment, many patients at the National Centre for Gaming Disorders report an improvement in their quality of life and a healthier relationship to gaming. It's important to know that, unlike some press outlets, the clinic does not demonise gaming at all through their treatment, nor do they support banning gaming entirely, something that came as a surprise. Instead, they're well aware of the positive impact gaming can have.
We're looking at not abstaining, which might be how you treat some other addictions, but actually changing the balance in the relationship, because often it will be that gaming has completely taken over that person's life. So we start to look at how to reintroduce other activities to start to motivate people to go back to school or work, addressing some of the underlying factors and enabling them to function in a way where they don't need to use gaming as a kind of coping strategy.
It's not a surprise that clinical psychologists like Rebecca are in favour of the WHO's decision when they work directly with patients. Clearly, for some people, gaming can have a really negative influence on their relationships and their mental health. The decision to define gaming disorder has, in that sense, done some good, as it's enabled people to access the care and support that they need. For some though, the concern is that with little evidence to pinpoint how much of the population are actually affected, some people may slip through the cracks.
My worry with it all is that we're not capturing the people we need to capture. There are treatments that will do something, right? But you don't want to be treating a symptom, you want to be treating the cause, so you don't want people to relapse or relapse into another form of addiction. I don't think the research base is good enough. I think we need to do a lot of work before we get to that point.
One thing that clearly doesn't help is the sort of sensationalist reporting we talked about earlier. Dramatic headlines risk demonising gaming among non-gamers as something that's incredibly toxic and harmful, but it also risks creating a sense among gamers that this is simply a moral panic and that psychologists are just trying to take their games away from them. Also, Fortnite, as it turns out, is not quite the problem some would have you believe.
Gaming generally is healthy, so like we talked about, it's about the balance and the impact and the associated distress. So for most people, this will not be a problem. I think the media can help increase understanding and awareness, but I think it has a responsibility to be kind of proportional in its discussions. And actually, the majority of our young people probably don't play Fortnite. There's a range of different games, but often that's not one of the ones that they play.
Rebecca wouldn't be drawn on which games they do see a lot, but some clinical psychologists have called for governmental bodies to regulate the games industry and hold them accountable for the impact of games with gameplay loops that could encourage compulsive play. Unsurprisingly, so far games developers have been unwilling to share data with addiction specialists that could shed some light on how people engage with their games. Given the lack of progress regulating something like loot boxes, any meaningful regulation on gaming addiction seems unlikely. Speaking of which, next week's episode of Mind Games is all about loot boxes, so make sure you're subscribed and check your feeds for that next week. In the short term at least, I find it a kind of comfort to know that people are researching games and the effect that they can have on us in our mental health, and also that clinics are available for people who may feel like they have a problem. If you're watching this video and you feel like you might need to speak to somebody about addiction, there are links below the video to services in both the UK and the US that can help. I'll see you next time.